I had planned this morning on presenting a video focusing on the questions that were most frequently missed, but I'm afraid that it may have to wait till tomorrow. The Blackboard system does not have a way of providing the information, so I'll need to download all the responses to every attempt and sort through them. I'll have that done by tomorrow. So, turning to this week's material, you are assigned two chapters to cover. Chapter 5 on the solo growth model and Chapter 8 on inflation. Chapter 5 is the longest chapter in the book and quite possibly one of the most important. By working through the chapter, you will get a good idea of how economists organize their thinking about the process of economic growth. You will see that the focus is on the supply side of the economy. Chapter 8 presents a number of important concepts, including the quantity theory of money, the real interest rate and its relationship to the nominal interest rate, and the concept of the classical dichotomy. A few words about Chapter 5. I do want to say that I probably would have had a different emphasis on the way the materials presented in the textbook. Your text develops the model, presents the evidence on the role of capital accumulation, and then goes on to stress that while capital accumulation is important, it is only one aspect of the growth process. In a way, it stresses the limitations of the model. I don't see this as a negative, and I wouldn't have been as critical. Without the solo model, and more importantly, without the concept of growth accounting that came out of the model, we wouldn't have known how to go about empirically testing and determining the sources of economic growth. If you look back historically, most economists through the 1960s and even today as well have always felt that capital accumulation is the driver of economic growth. In order to grow, you save and then invest. They found support for this hypothesis in three historical events. First, they pointed to the period between the mid to late 1800s in the US, Canada, and Argentina. In the economic history literature, these areas were known as the regions of recent settlement, which experienced large increases in growth due to what is presumed are substantial inflows of capital from Western Europe, Great Britain in particular. This capital was used to create infrastructure, develop canals, waterways, railroad, and heavy industry. Secondly, we have the example of the Soviet Union. In the 1930s, the USSR was considered an economic miracle and a miracle to be emulated by others seeking to develop. By raising its savings rate forcefully and brutally through the collectivization of agriculture and the forced movement of workers to urban areas, it channeled resources into capital accumulation, so that in a short period of time it had changed from a largely agrarian and feudal society to an industrial behemoth. The last historical event that seemed to buttress the case for capital accumulation was the Marshall Plan. After World War II, the United States and Allies wanted to avoid the post-war conditions that had given rise to Nazi Germany. Rather than taxing Germany and further impoverishing the Germans, the Marshall Plan provided for the massive transfer of capital to Germany and other war-ravaged countries in Western Europe. To many, this was clearly a sign of the powerful effect of capital accumulation, because after a period of 5 to 6 years, production levels were back to post-war levels in most of Western Europe. Despite this anecdotal data, we didn't have a framework like the solo model to help us to sort out empirically the contribution of capital accumulation. This, I believe, was one of the major contributions of this framework. Now I want to close today by saying a few words about this morning's announcements of the 2011 winners of the Nobel Prize in Economics. The two professors won because their work in macroeconomics. They are Thomas Sargent at New York University and Christopher Sims at Princeton University. They won their prize for their development of statistical tools for use in macroeconomics. Thomas Sargent, for instance, who was strongly influenced by the rational expectations revolution, which argued that economic actors changed their behavior in anticipation of policy changes, developed a statistical technique for sorting out or separating out the effects of policy changes on the economy versus those effects that were due to the response of economic actors to the policy change. This, for instance, had a strong influence on understanding the shape of the Phillips curve. Governments could not keep an economy operating above capacity by continuing to fool economic actors with high inflation. Ultimately, the economic actors, such as workers, would recognize that their real wages were falling due to inflation, and then they would demand higher wages consistent with the higher inflation, and hence the policy would become ineffective. Chris Sims, on the other hand, developed what is called VAR, or vector autoregression analysis, which immensely improved economic forecasting in the study of how an economy evolves after a shock. Essentially, what it did is simplify the estimation of economic models. He went directly to the estimation of a simpler model or structural model, as opposed to first developing a full-blown macroeconomic model in equation form, then solving the model for GDP and all other endogenous variables, and then estimating the parameters of these equations. The work of both these individuals is reflected in the book you are currently using. Now remember, in closing, if you have any questions regarding the material and concepts we are studying, I am almost always online in case you need clarification. Good luck on this week's material.